Welcome back, class. We are in our fifth week here, and today we're going to talk about language choice. We're going to talk about social motivations for language use in interpersonal interactions, and we're also going to focus today's case study on Cameroon. So I hope that you guys did your readings. This is a very interesting case of bilingualism, multilingualism, what happens when the official languages, like we talked about in previous classes with Belgium. In this case of Cameroon, we don't see that the languages are, the official languages at least, are often spoken. There are many different choices when it comes to language use. And we'll also talk about code switching. Okay, so most of your discussion questions have to do about code switching. So, just to give you some context on multilingualism versus monolingualism. As I talked about in previous classes, multilingualism is a very common phenomenon, right? Most of the people around the world, they speak a different language. It is, and most of the parts of the United States, I think, speak a different language other than English. But then some people are monolingual, right? And that's okay, right? All linguistic varieties, it's worth noting that they are not socially equal. Remember, in a linguistic standpoint, they are linguistically equal, which means that all languages um, are valued, right? Each language is valued. So there's not a single language that's higher or lower than another linguistically, right? But socially, languages carry different connotations. They carry what's called socio-psychological baggage. Each variety gets this baggage largely from the speakers most associated with using that variety and from the situations in which the variety is used as the most appropriate choice. So, for the most part, when you use a language, you are using a choice, right? And linguists would say that it is not random that you are using this language, especially in a multilingual instance. In a community in which speakers they may switch between languages or varieties, or maybe monolinguals, right? If you have different dialects, maybe you'll switch, you might use different registers, like a formal or informal register, depending on who you speak with. This is dependent on your choice. You're choosing to use a language. So it's not arbitrary. That means that it is not um, random, right? You don't choose to address someone as sir or ma'am randomly. It is mostly because you don't feel close with this person, right? So for example, if you were to use sir or ma'am to your mom or dad, they unless you're in trouble, right? It's less likely that you're going to use this because this is more of a formal instance, or it portrays a level of respect. Usually, sometimes you'll call your mom, mom, or dad, dad, or papa, or mama, or baba, in whatever language that you choose. It's more informal that way with family. Um, so, and then also, not all speech communities are organized in the same way. There might be different interpersonal relationships depending on the styles and registers that you use for elders, for teachers, for clergy people, for people that you don't know, for people who are in high levels of respect. I know for me, growing up in the South, if I had to address an older person, I would usually say Miss Karen, right? I wouldn't say Karen if I were to call them by their first name. Most and that's if I don't know their last name at all, right? Like if I only knew their first name, I would have to add a a prefix to it. And there's also symbolic motivations for choice, like we talked about with diglossia. Remember, a diglossic situation occurs when languages are unequal in a society. So, for example, we talked about how in Germany, there's various high levels of German and low levels of German, and you would use different types depending on the situation and who you're talking about or talking to. There's also acts of identity. So your language choice also depends on how you choose to identify. Um, Again, if you decide to, if you grew up in the South and you are not identified with Southern culture, then you might change your language depending on like where you do identify, and vice versa. I did my research for my master's on Hmong individuals. So Hmong is they're a community that originally come from Southeast Asia, and they migrated to parts of the United States. There's a lot of Hmong people in California and in Minnesota and in North Carolina. And so, a lot of them who moved to North Carolina, they kind of adopt a Southern accent. And so their language choice really depends less on their culture or their heritage and more on the community in which they live. So, Grice, he was a linguist back in the day. He came up with what's called a cooperative principle. Okay, and the cooperative principle was he's kind of like the father of modern pragmatics, and he said that within a language, I think he was mostly speaking about English, but he said you need to make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage of which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. So, this is a very complicated way of speaking. Of course, he's talking in a very academic sense. But basically, you just want to speak in a way that is natural to the situation, and you want to follow certain principles of conversation. So the first one is the relevance principle, and so this means that you have everything you talk about, everything you say. There's an intention behind what you have to say, and so in your communication is you're kind of doing like a cost benefit analysis between the reward of understanding the stimulus and the processing required to make sense of the stimulus. So, for example, if John was to say, "Do you think my baby is handsome?" and Mary says, "I think it has a lovely personality," then this violates the relevance principle because the lovely personality has nothing to do with the handsome, whether or not she thinks the baby is handsome. So, why is Mary violating this principle? Well, it's because she probably thinks the baby is ugly, right? And so she is violating this. She's doing a cost benefit analysis, right? And she can't say, in this situation, she doesn't want to say, "No, I think your baby's ugly," right? But she wants to say, she still wants to tell the truth, right? And so she says, "Oh, I think it has a lovely personality," which has nothing to do with whether or not it's handsome. And so it's violating this principle because she is trying to elicit another intention. There's another intention involved in her response. So let's talk about extended diglossia. So, there might be domains and situations which determine a choice, right? And then whether or not you say the wrong choice results in rejection. So, like in the previous instance, Mary is probably very close to John. I hope so. If she is saying that the baby has a lovely personality, if John is asking, well, first of all, John has to be pretty close to Mary, right? You're not just going to ask a stranger, "Hey, do you think my baby's handsome?" I think Mary was more, Mary and John are pretty close here, and Mary's probably joking, right? But what if Mary was real? What if Mary is like, "I think has a lovely personality"? Then maybe John will reject her in some way, right? So, this is kind of also an instance in which if you use a wrong language or if you violate a principle, then you'll also be rejected in your various interpersonal communication. So, if you're using a second language among all native but bilingual speakers, right? Depending on who you use a language to, right? Even if they're, bilingual, um, it, might be seen as a wrong instance. Or if you're using a low language in a high language domain, right? So, this is this might be a sense of when you might get rejected by your peers, right? And so this choice is not always a conscious one. We know, for example, that children, say sometimes they say the darndest things, they say the truth, right? But because they're not socialized into figuring out what is the right or wrong choice in these instances, right? There's also economic, administrative, cultural, political, religious pressures that influence language choice. So whether or not you know, if you want to, if you belong to the upper class, right? But then you go to, somewhere, the Bronx or something, um, you're going to really look out of place. And so these competing pressures can result in unclear domains and result in unexpected choice, right? Because it's not that there's always like a one-to-one situation. So if I'm going into a certain environment where I don't know a lot of people, I'm not really sure which language choice I'm going to use here. Kind of like with the clip of Phoebe and Friends. So there's also social distance, right? Honorifics and referential deference. So, in cases of, for example, Korean or Japanese, you might have to use an honorific. So, this indexes the status of the referent or the hierarchy, right? Depending on who the referent is. You are you're making a choice based on who you are so in a social hierarchy. If someone is an elder, if someone has a higher rank than you, then you might refer to them as doctor, sir, your excellency, professor, right? I get a lot of these emails, Dr. Chung, Professor Chung, right? And that shows that you respect me, hopefully, right? Not to say that if you call me May, it doesn't mean that you don't respect me, but this kind of shows like there's a social distance between us, right? Because you're a student and I'm a professor. It could be interactional. So this also indexes the relative pronouns, or relative status, sorry, of the interlocutor. So in French and in Spanish, right, you have a certain verb that you would use depending on whether or not you're talking to a stranger or you're talking to someone who's more familiar to you. So like a tu versus vous situation. So in all these cases, there's certain dynamics at play. There's power, there's solidarity, there's social proximity, there's distance, right? So language is interacting within all these different factors to determine language choice. And there's also speech accommodation theory, okay? So speech accommodation theory just means that you are able to change your language use not only on the situation, but also depending on who you are addressing. So there's two very funny videos, right? The first one is a sketch from Key and Peele. And I think you should watch this. I really love Key and Peele. But basically, Key and Michael Key is portraying I think he's portraying President Obama, and he's meeting various people. And they're also, maybe that's Peele, I'm not sure. But basically, they are, they're trying to accommodate their speech depending on who they are addressing, like whether or not they are Black, basically. Also another really funny video, someone who's bilingual, who's Afro-Caribbean probably, is code switching to various people at work. So whether or not they meet someone who they might find romantically interesting versus someone who's like a coworker they don't know very well versus someone who that speak Spanish. So it's they go throughout their workday and code switch depending on the different interactions. So I found this video really funny and interesting. So it's really speech accommodation theory consists of accommodating to your interlocutor. You're speaking more like the person you're talking to. Okay. So I found this a lot when I was in Singapore, traveling around Singapore for a month, and I found that my American English started to sound more Australian, and I was like, where did this Australian accent come from? I don't really spend that much time in Australia. And it had to do with the English that they speak in Singapore. Or first of all, there is Singlish, but a lot of people study abroad in Australia or go abroad to Australia, so their English sounds more like an Australian accent. And so I was kind of wanting to speak English, and not project that I was American. A lot of people have watched videos of, I think, Lindsay Lohan. She has a club in Greece or something like that, and she spends a lot of time in the Middle East, and so her accent sounds a little more accommodating, right, to kind of this worldly accent, right? People are like, why are you talking like that? And speech accommodation theory would explain it. So whether or not you're accommodating away from your interlocutor, we call it divergence, right? So if you, want to distinguish yourself, right, from somebody, then you might, change your way of speaking. Some people do this in like more formal instances, right? They're code switching. And also the audience design, right? If there are many participants, like they may affect who the speaker is. And so another really funny skit from Key and Peele, but they're kind of accommodating their language depending on who so they're not even talking to the person, but just whoever is around you at that moment can influence how you speak. It could be your addressee, it could be the auditor, it could be an overhearer, it could be eavesdropper, right? So all of these different people can have a choice of your variants and styles. So at UMBC, when I was getting my doctorate, I have two people in my committee who are Korean descent. They're Korean American, and they're both in the education department. And, when they were around each other, they started speaking English. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. Like, if you're both Korean descent, why aren't you speaking Korean? And so I asked, of course, like, we all study linguistics. So I asked them that. I said, oh, you speak, I know that you're bilingual in Korean and English. Like, why are you speaking in English? If Korean is like, if they have both moved from Korea in their like 20s or 30s. And they said, English is just easier because we're at like a work setting, right? And also there's things like, again, lost in translation. And so, like I feel like if they were at a different party where they're mostly Koreans, maybe they would code switch. But at a school setting, especially, I think because I was around, like I was this little eavesdropper person over here, they're like, okay, like let's speak English, right? Or there could be societal pressures, like we talked about, right? Societal, economic, political. There could be a lot of factors, but I thought it was very interesting that they both had the language choice of English. So this is kind of what I talked about earlier about whether things are marked versus unmarked. So we would say that speakers would choose the form of their conversational contribution such that it indexes a set of rights and obligations which you wish to be enforced between a speaker and addressee for the current exchange. So something is marked if it is kind of out of the ordinary, quote unquote, or unexpected, or it's a different language choice, right? So if it is if you're in the South and you're using like a Boston accent, so your Boston accent will be marked. Same thing if you're in Boston, everyone's speaking a Boston accent around you and you're using your Southern accent, that would be marked. So this is kind of in some cases it has to be kind of recognized by the society in order to be marked. So if you're able to, speak a language that, that no one really picks up on, it really wouldn't be marked. But it depends on also the situation. So why do people code switch? We talked about them code switching as an identity marker. We talked about them code switching maybe pragmatically, right? So like, for politeness, for everyone involved doesn't speak Spanish, so I'm just gonna speak English for everybody, right? It could be discursive, right? So there's been research done on bilinguals and multilinguals who use English because, or who use English for to display their emotions. And these are people who maybe come from China, who I think the study was talking about Chinese individuals who are bilingual in Chinese and English, but if they want to talk about their feelings, they use English, right? Because it was like very easy to say, like, I love you or something like that in English. And it was really difficult to say I love you in Chinese for, for various reasons, right? So it's not always clear which code is used in code switching. This is a clip from Talking Black in America. This is a documentary produced by my advisor, Walt Wolfram. He is an acclaimed sociolinguist at North Carolina State University. And so he had this grant from the National Science Foundation to explore, like, what are the different code switching situations, right? Why would African Americans code switch? And in what situations and how? And, how should we, should that be valued? Should that be denigrated? Like, what does it say about culture? What does it say about our society? So it's a long clip, but it's very interesting. And I recommend when a movie comes out to watch for the documentary. It's very interesting. So, language choice or language constraints, right? What are the reasons that someone might speak a language, and what are the reasons that might hold someone back from speaking a language? Could be personal relationships, could be social statuses of the languages. If case like maybe standard American English has a more valued social status in an academic session, academic instance like a school, but maybe when you go to if you go to the Bronx and you speak in New York and you speak the language that they speak there, you might be more included in the society. So you probably wouldn't use SAE. It could be social professional obligations. In what social groups are bilingual individuals found? That's an interesting question. When I talk to a lot of people who work in construction, they always say like, "Oh, it's like so valued for me to learn Spanish." I talk to a lot of people who work in a restaurant, right? And so they always say like, speaking Spanish or speaking Chinese or speaking whatever kind of restaurant it is so valuable. So it's not always the language choice kind of differs depending on what situation you're in. Is it because they're linguistic minorities? Not always, right? Not always. Some linguistic minorities may move to the United States and they find that they don't want to speak their native language. They want to speak English, right? Migrants might be that way. Refugees might be that way. They might have trauma. They might have trauma, in their native languages, and so they don't want to interact in that language. When I was teaching ESL, I had a student from like he was Montagnard. He came from the mountains in Vietnam. And I was like, yeah, like if you want to speak Vietnamese to me, like, here I am, just like woke, ESL teacher, like, yeah, speak Vietnamese to me. And he was like, oh, I prefer not, because he was an indigenous minority. He was a migrant. He wanted to escape his home country where he was being persecuted by the local authorities, right? So that really humbled me. That was, bad on my part. Pragmatic, right? Everyday practice. Um, in that, I'm sure you guys are learning different languages at UMBC, but it's very hard to speak a different language, especially here, right? Especially in America. It's really hard to speak any other language other than English. You have to like change your phone settings if you want to learn Russian, and you have to find, Russian conversation partners and things like that. Like it takes a lot of practice. Political posturing. For political reasons, you might use a different language. There was a study done, this is years back, but they looked at Bill Clinton and the fact that, he had this like charming, Arkansas accent. And that's why like a lot of people voted for him because he seemed like he was like a down to earth guy, someone who can be relatable. Expressivity and affect, like we talked about, in some languages, is just more vibrant. Like, for example, there's a video that I produced in one of my graduate school classes called Voices UMBC. So we went out and we interviewed people from different, different people, mostly my former students, and we talked about them using their languages, and they said, yeah, like Spanish, I'm able to express a lot more in Spanish. Like, I'm able to, I had this friend, her name was Martha, and hopefully she doesn't mind me talking about her in this recording. But Martha is just very shy. She's a native English speaker. She's very, very, very shy. It's hard to understand what she's saying. You're always like, what did you say? Like, what, Martha? Speak up. But Martha learned Spanish, and when she learned Spanish, she's like, soy Marta. Like, she's, very expressive. And so maybe you have, I don't, want to say, maybe you have a different personality in a different language, right? It could all depend. So this is from your textbook. This is really what this is something that I really liked, this quote. The endless interplay between constraint and choice means that identities are necessarily dynamic, emergent, and contextual rather than static, predetermined, and immutable, right? And I would argue that the experience of learning a language really interacts with your identity, right? So if you guys are learning Korean, you might have a different personality in Korean, right? Or your identity might be changed by the mere fact that you are learning Korean, right? Isn't that cool? Isn't that amazing? Maybe you can put it in the chat. What do you think about that? Right. So our case study will be on language choice in multilingual Cameroon. Multilingual Cameroon. So we're gonna look at Cameroon, and maybe you can compare or contrast from Belgium, right? How we talked about Belgium was like a bilingual country, not without certain complexities, of course, but there's also even more complexities in Cameroon, a place that is officially multilingual. To give you some backdrop, Cameroon's a country in West Central Africa. It's bordered by Nigeria, Chad, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Republic of Gabon, Republic of Congo. It used to be, there were some parts of Cameroon that used to be part of Nigeria, which kind of features heavily into some of the language choices that we'll talk about soon. So pre-colonial, Cameroon, there were many, many, many tribes. There were many migrations, different languages, right? Cameroon is Papua New Guinea. Cameroon is one of the most multilingual places on earth, right? There's so many indigenous languages. There's so many tribes. Each tribe has their own language. Each tribe has their own custom and culture, right? And so, again, when we talk about borders in this class, please note that the borders aren't necessarily defined. People aren't defined by their borders. Languages aren't defined by borders, right? And so, just keep note of this when you are examining, doing the readings about Cameroon. So there was a strong emotional relationship between language and ethnicity. So if you belong to the Bantu tribe and you spoke Bantu, right? There was a very strong relationship, right? So this is like the language of your ancestors. We talked about Guatemala last class and about how people could trace their ancestry back to these Aztecs, right, who built all these great ruins. And the same thing about Cameroon, like these languages were associated with the kings and the queens of their tribes. And so, of course, they're going to be attached to this language, right? The language expresses solidarity with their people. It was a shibboleth. It determined whether or not you belonged. And it also corresponds with their tribal affiliation, right? So you knew when you passed from one tribe to another, depending on what tribe you belong to, depending on what language you spoke. Um, Language can set people apart from others or bring them together, like we talked about with speech accommodation, right? Was there accommodation or was there divergence? It depended on the situation. Like if you were going to go to another tribe, then you better speak their language because they have a strong emotional connection. So, a history of colonialism, the Portuguese came, they noticed the abundance of shrimp, so they named it Rio de Camarones. So that's where you get that's where Cameroon comes, right? And so they set up sugar plantations. That's when the slave trade really took off. And then the Dutch were able to take over the slave trade. So really heavy stuff, but this is kind of part of the colonialist history, and it kind of explains kind of the language choices today. Cameroon has been passed through many hands, but basically it became a German protectorate at one point. And then basically all of Europe were, not all of them, but like a lot of European nations were going and colonizing these places and signing various treaties, being like, okay, well, you have this land for this land, I'll give you this land for that land. And, so there was like a Franco-German conflict over Morocco, and basically France ceded some of its territories in order to gain Morocco. So then, so basically, Cameroon has been passed by many hands. And then, after the war, the British and the French troops, or during the war, they forced the Germans to leave Cameroon. And so they kind of split up this nation, right? So they split up the nation into like 80% French and then 20% British. And so, and Nigeria was also like a British protectorate or colony back in the day too. So they decided, like, really arbitrary stuff, right? Like they just like split it down where they thought it was like, okay, we're just going to draw this line. But obviously the people have been living there for centuries, right? And they spoke their own languages. So they were finally able to gain independence. French Cameroon was able to gain independence, become the Republic of Cameroon, right? So this is the first president, and this was their republic, their logo. And you can see, like, even looking at their flag, that they have some things in French, right? And then, this is over 60 years ago, but then they had this referendum about independence, right? So then Southern Cameroon, right, the British part of Nigeria were to gain independence and join the Republic of Cameroon. So then the territory becomes the Federal Republic of Cameroon. And then the British Northern Cameroon gains independence by joining the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So basically, during this time, like the people had a referendum, like a vote of whether or not they wanted to join Nigeria or they wanted to join Cameroon. And at the time, Cameroon was a little bit richer. The French speaking part was a little bit richer. And so they said, okay, I wanted to join the Federal Republic of Cameroon, whereas the British speaking part, they were able to join Nigeria. So this kind of cut up Cameroon a little bit more. So, uh, of course, the colonists, they refused to learn no local languages. Okay, so if you take in my previous classes, you kind of understand a little bit about pigeons and creoles. I'll also kind of explain what pigeons and creoles are a little bit. But in an equal situation with contact languages, like if I spoke a different language and you spoke a different language, and we were in an equal relationship, then we would form what's called a pigeon. In this case, the colonists were like, yeah, I'm not going to speak your native language. You're going to speak my language. So, obviously a lot of power dynamics here, but they were able to impose their European languages as the official languages. And the way they did that was, or the reason why is because they said they wanted to ensure political cohesion, right? So, again, with all these different tribes, like some would fight each other, all these neighboring tribes, they were always at war, or they weren't always at peace. But what these European nations did was they came by and said, okay, listen, we're going to build a nation in Cameroon. We're all going to speak French and English. So they basically set the native languages as in Cameroon. So they could say, okay, we're building a new nation, right? So this is their quote unquote excuse. So the diglossic situation in Cameroon then became that the higher languages, so the languages that were used for government and for power, those would be English and French. And then the lower languages that were used among the local people and like the markets and for trade and things like that, those were the indigenous languages, the tribal languages that they had spoken for thousands of years in Cameroon. So during the colonial rule, they really, really pressed this, right? They said, all right, if you are fluent in English and French, and before, I don't really think the Dutch and the Germans really cared. I think the English and French were like, yes, like you need to learn these languages because they're a quote passport to a better life. They also said it as the medium of education, and then they also said, okay, well, if you're going to continue speaking your African languages, they continue to denigrate them. Like they saw them as inferior, inadequate, which, of course, like we said, linguistically is not true. So, in this post colonial context, we have what's in the reading referred to as a eukolonia. Many people in post-colonial contexts display this eukolonia tendency because they tend to undervalue many things that have their contextual reality and favor Western constructs. Some people in such contexts now perceive their own culture and indigenous languages as inferior. They think that the colonial languages are the only media through which effective communication can take place and are even ready to negotiate their own identities to embrace one that strongly links them to the Western world. So it's kind of like it's like kind of like a little like linguistic gaslighting almost. Like when you ask people, they said, "Oh, I speak this language, even though this language has been spoken by your tribes for thousands of years and by kings and queens and it's part of your history." They don't have really a sense of pride. They say, "Oh no, this is really inferior." So they really internalize this colonialist mindset in favor of like a Western construct. And this really shows how strong these Western ideologies are, right? Like they are able to say like, oh yeah, people should learn English and people should learn French because, it's important, and, but they don't think the same way about their native languages, right? And so it's kind of like they are, the people are like kind of being gaslit into this, right? Very strong colonialist stuff. So the languages in Cameroon, officially it's French and English. But as we found out last class, not it's even if they're official languages, they don't often it doesn't often show up in everyday life. So in everyday life they might use Camtalk, which is a Cameroonian pidgin English, Or they'll use comme franglais, which is like a mixture between French and English. Or they'll use bogotok. So Cameroon, like again, very linguistically diverse because historically it's been linguistically diverse. After Papua New Guinea, which we already covered, is like one of the most linguistically diverse places, and Vanuatu, Cameroon is the third most linguistically diverse country. So there's going to be lots of different diglossic situations happening. Just to give you a review of, when we talk about pidgin, like what do we mean? So a pidgin is, like I said, in a contact situation when these two or more languages combine, they contact each other, like there's communication between people, then they kind of grammatically simplify their language, right? So they might have a limited vocabulary. They might take some aspects from English. You might take some aspects from French, from from the local languages. But then when it becomes a mother tongue, aka when the children use it, when the youth use it, then it becomes a Creole. Okay. Here's where it gets a little confusing. It's confusing because some things are called pidgin, but linguistically they're Creole. So, for example, Cameroonian pidgin English is actually a Creole, okay? Because it's used by the local people. Used by the youth. Used by the youth, okay? So you have to look at, is it used by the youth? Because if it is, if it's their mother tongue, it's a Creole. To give you an example, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, has a pidgin website where you can read news in pidgin. Okay, so I just took a headline about Megan Fox, right? And the headline says, "Why drink each other? Why drink all the blood?" Engagement proposal post of Megan Fox Day cause TikTok. I think TikTok maybe it's like causes like a what do you call it? Like a fervor or something like that. Like it causes controversy, maybe a tuk. And so, yeah, you can actually read the story, right? I put the link here. The 35-year-old actress made the announcement on Wednesday as she shared one video of Dia intimate proposal, say the engagement happened Tuesday, January 11th. For July of 2020, we sat down under this banyan tree. We asked for magic, she talked for Instagram posts. We know they aware of the pain we go face together for such a short period of time. So again, it's kind of like a grammatically simplified version of English and then maybe a local language happening. But this website's actually written in Creole. Okay, it's written in Creole. It's not random. A lot of people say that, like, read this and they say, "Oh my gosh, it sounds so random," right? But it's actually a Creole, right? It's people call this emerging language. Some people would call pidgins full-fledged languages, right? So very interesting. I'll give you some examples. Camtalk, remember? So Cameroon Pidgin English, Camtalk, is an English-based Creole. 5% of native speakers speak it fluently. But this is kind of born from the contact between the slaves and their slave owners back in the day. Related to the West African Pidgin English spoken, right? And there's also lots of similarities between Cameroon Pidgin English and some African American varieties today. What's one of the major lingua francas? A lingua franca is kind of a shared language use between people who speak different languages. So if you're in a room full of like a German speaker, a Russian speaker, a Japanese speaker, you might use English as a lingua franca. It's called lingua franca, I think, because back in the day they used French. So here's an example of something that's English and something that's Camtalk. Okay. The boy who came yesterday was annoyed that he was not accepted. After a quarrel with me, he went off sorry for himself. So the boy we come yesterday be vexed say them no gri. After we quarrel with me, he cannot go. Sorry. Right? So you can tell that they have like a very English structure, but there are some local languages being mixed in. So the differences between Cam Talk and Confranglais, right? So Cam Talk is a pidginization of English, so like a kind of the reduced grammatical forms, whereas Confranglais has a very vernacular appropriation of French. English is kind of the superimposed language, but you don't have to master English. Whereas Franglais, you kind of need to know French in order to understand it. Syntax, different from English, although the lexicon is English based. And Franglais has French syntax with everyday French words and some loan words from English and or various local pidgin languages. Here's a nice video that talks about Franglais. The speaker in this video kind of talks about like why it's important to use this language, right? So, some features of Franglais, okay. Viens go jouer le damba. Come, let's go play soccer. Il y a one body qui te fala ici. Someone came looking for you here. So again, it's like predominantly French. They're using French grammar, French syntax, but you can kind of see that they are able to use a little bit of English, right? So they say go, right? They say body. They say all day. My big, okay, means my elder sister, my big sister. Ne me bring pas ton dutu, don't bring ill luck upon me. So that might be actually a mix of English, French, and a local language. So, you're using French syntax here, but you use bring, right? Which is English, and maybe no dutu is something that's more local. So, again, this is not random. This is something that is used as a Creole. Okay, it's used by the local people. It's used by the young people. And then you have Mombotok. Okay, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But this is a language I really don't like how they. I don't really like how they described it. Okay, so maybe if there's a better way of describing it, please email me. But according to the reading, they describe it as a language used by quote unquote unemployed people. Okay. As if that was like a bad thing. But, anyways, unemployed people who embark on all types of activities, especially commercial activities, to raise money for their daily bread. Okay. Again, just because they're not employed doesn't mean that they're raising money. I feel like it's like they're not employed by like a government or like a business, right? It's a very capitalistic word, but whatever. So it's used in the text, but I don't like it. And so it comes from mboko, which means a irresponsible person, and tok, which means talk. And right, so if you're in this group, remember when I talked about like, this is kind of denigrating. Like, I don't want to be called mbokoto, right? Like, if you said that to me, I would be like upset. But remember that there's this linguistic gaslighting in which they like say like, yes, like I speak this language, but it's not great, right? They kind of like the colonialist mindset is so strong where, or there's such an ideology that's so pervasive that they think this way. But anyways, so this is kind of like their characterization of this language. So again, who speaks what? And remember what I said about the youth, okay? Remember what I said about the youth. So they did a study in which they looked at what the francophones, right, the people who speak French versus the people who speak English, and then they ranged it by age group, okay? So you can see here that 100% of the francophone group speaks Franglais, right? And they also speak French, okay? And then in the Anglophone group, they speak English natively. They speak English, but they don't necessarily speak Franglais, okay? And remember the percentages, if it's 100%, You're like, that's 200%. But don't forget they're bilingual, okay? They speak French, but they also speak Cam Franglais. As we get into the next generation, okay, so like a young adult, older adult, they mostly speak, of course, English and French, but you see a little bit less about the Cam Franglais. So this is really like an emerging language among the youth, okay, Cam Franglais. Whereas like they're most likely to speak Cam Talk, right, the English Pidgin, and their indigenous languages, okay. And then in the oldest generation, 40 and above, they're 100% fluent in their indigenous languages. So you can see as time goes on, the indigenous languages, people who are speaking them regularly, fluent in them regularly, are declining. And they're most likely are able to speak Cam Talk, right? And you have the most high percentage of Mbok Talk as well. So very interesting, right? Very interesting because like the younger generation who are more likely to be unemployed, right, are not speaking Mbok Talk, they're speaking Cam Franglais, whereas the older generation are speaking their indigenous languages and are speaking Cam Talk. So when they actually interviewed why, so they interviewed like, okay, so like what is your language choice, okay? And they also determined, why would you use this choice? So maybe they would speak Cam Franglais. They would say, okay, I speak Cam Franglais because it is the language of people in my age group. So obviously, like they're young, right? It's fashionable, it's hip, it's like kind of like slang, right? If they don't choose Cam Franglais, it's because they think it's the language of children. It's childish, right? It's kind of like for me to use some slang, you're like, oh my gosh, you're just trying to be cool, but you're not cool, right? What about Cam Talk? Some people say, if they use Cam Talk, they say, oh yeah, it's like, the language of intimacy among my friends. Like my friends and I, when we get together, we speak Cam Talk, right? And it also guarantees communication with every Cameroonian, right? So it kind of is just like this unifying language. Whenever you enter a group situation and not everyone speaks the same language, you're able to use Cam Talk with each other. And some people think, no, I'm not using Cam Talk because I don't want to quote unquote contaminate my English, because as we saw before, it's a very pidgin language, a Creole language, right? Mbokotok, right? So very few people use this language. As I said before, because just like reading the way it was described, like one would say like, I don't feel comfortable speaking this language because it's for struggling people. It's for people who are quote unquote unemployed. Okay, so it's also associated with morality. Like just because they don't have a job, people are like, oh, they're not morally inept, which is very false, right? Indigenous languages, okay? Indigenous languages, they say it's the mother tongue, right? It's their cultural identity, it's their village, it's their home. But some people, if they don't speak it, they don't know how. They only speak French or English, where they didn't grow up in the village, they grew up in the city. What about English, right? If they speak English, they say, it's one of the official languages. They can speak to people who, to people from Nigeria. English is the way, for opportunities. And some people don't speak English because, A, they find it very difficult to speak English, or there's just limited opportunities to learn, okay? So, given that the Anglophones speak only French and Pidgin English, it's very hard to, learn, quote unquote, true English. And then French, right? So French, they speak French. It's because it's one of the official languages. They are able to interact with Francophones who don't speak English. They're able to use the language in their home. And if they don't use French, it's because they don't look at this. It's the language of domination and exploitation. Wow. which is interesting because you don't find this in English, right? Because English is also a language of domination and exploitation, but they said it was French. They don't like French culture, they don't like its languages, and or that they think it offers limited opportunities. So again, compare this with Belgium, right? So like Cameroon has an official language bilingualism, but there's a divide. There's a divide between the Anglophones and the Francophones. It's like they have two distinct education systems. There's also little done to develop standardized Cameroon French and English. They have severely limited resources, right? Like in the survey, they talked about opportunity. Like some people don't have the opportunity to learn English in their schools or French in their schools. They're learning Cam Franglais. And, excludes many native language speakers from participation in public life, right? So, while Cameroon has these two official languages, English and French, the reality is they're really speaking a mixture. They're speaking Cam Franglais, they're speaking Camtok, they're speaking Mboko, they're speaking indigenous languages. Right, so, we call this one-way bilingualism. Speakers of English operating increasingly or fully in French, but the French-speaking counterparts remaining largely monolingual. So if you're an English speaker, you're kind of learning the French, you're speaking the French. Of course, you can find the ties to its colonials past. And, but if you grew up French, then you're not really learning English. You're mostly speaking Cam Franglais if you're young, or French. So in a post-colonial context, right? Because we recognize the colonialists, we recognize Europeans, right? But we want to move away from it, okay? So what can we do? One strategy is to promote a local language as an official to replace the colonial languages, okay? So, and think about what it would do for like the pride of the country, right? Like, and saying, instead of saying like we were a colonized territory, they can say, okay, well, let's have another official language. Let's have Cameroonian Pidgin English, right? Could it be selected as a new official language to unify the two Cameroons? But there's also ideologies, okay? We'll talk about ideologies more next class, but a lot of people think that if you don't speak Pidgin, it's not like a real language, quote unquote, okay? If you don't speak a Creole, because really what they're referring to is a Creole, but if you don't speak true French or true English, then it's not good, right? It says English is the password, not Pidgin. Pidgin's taking a heavy toll on your English. Shun it! The better you speak Pidgin, the worse you will write in English, which is not true. Pidgin is a lingua franca good for only non-academic environments. Do not use it on campus. By order, okay? So this is very interesting because it's kind of like, remember we talked about code switching? Like, what if they did this with Spanglish? That would be terrible. And some people do think, like, you shouldn't speak Spanglish. You should only speak Spanish or English, right? But in the essence, like, Spanglish is a type of Creole. It could be a type, it was a Pidgin on this type of Creole. Hawaiian Creole, Hawaiian Pidgin English, right? Other languages which don't have this recognized variety, because it doesn't have an official status, maybe, right? So very interesting thoughts. The discussion questions focus on code switching. So do you think that there's a difference between code switching in different languages and code switching in different dialects? Can you name specific instances of how you code switch? Who experiences stigma from code switching? Can you think of anyone who experiences societal benefit from code switching? And this is about markedness, but when does code switching go unnoticed and why? Thank you for your attention, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on the discussion board. See you then.